Welcome to the World Class Speaking podcast series. This is a place where you will learn how to present, persuade, and profit by improving your communication skills. Each episode in the series is a chapter from the book World Class Speaking in Action. And each chapter is written by a certified world class speaking coach. I'm your host, Matt Miller, and I've carefully crafted and summarized each chapter in the book. Do you want your audience to leave your speech or presentation fired up, inspired, and ready to take action? If so, stay tuned for this episode, which is all about closing with impact to leave your audience on a high. This episode is Closing with Impact, Leave Your Audience on a High, and it is episode 9. It's by Robert Gordon, and Robert Gordon is a certified world-class speaking coach. He is a speech trainer and is also a keynote speaker. Now, why is this episode important? Well, closing with impact is important because we tend to remember most what we hear or see first and last of any event or piece of work. So remember that. And in this case, we remember what we hear first, but we also take away what we hear last. And there's a quote, and it's common in the speaking industry, and it's your last words linger. Your last words linger. Now, when closing with impact, you want to leave your audience with something to remember. Here's a couple things that you don't want to do. Something that's common that we need to get away from is ending with a question and answer session. We don't want to do this because it leaves way too much open to chance. For example, as a speaker, you could have given an amazing speech and then you open up to Q&A and then you get somebody in the audience who's aggravated. They ask you an unfair question and then you're either not able to answer it or you answer it poorly because you weren't set up for success. So many different things can happen. It can get out of control. It can last way too long. Too many variables. So that's something you don't want to do. You don't want to end your speech with a question and answer because there's too many variables that can make it end up poor. Another thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to introduce anything new. There isn't enough time to go in depth on a new subject. That's something that you don't want to do. However, there is a couple things that you do want to do while closing. So number one is you want to let your audience know that you're about to close your speech because they're going to pay attention to your final words. And the second thing that you want to do is you want to designate around 10% of your speech to the closing. That means if you're giving a 60-minute keynote speech, you could expect about 6 minutes to be designated towards closing. So to summarize, two things that you should not do is you should not end with a question and answer session, and you should not introduce anything new. And two things that you should do is you should let your audience know that you're about to close your speech, so pay attention. And then you want to designate roughly 10% of your speech to the closing. Now, this doesn't mean that you should not have a question and answer. It just shouldn't come last. A lot of people still will have a question and answer section. It will come second to last. And then you can basically set yourself up by saying earlier in the speech, I'm going to open it up for question and answers. So you start thinking about which questions you'd want to ask. And that'll get the audience to write them down. And then it won't be spur of the moment, raise their hand and ask anything off the top of their head. And then once you get to the point where you're going to have that question and answer session, a good way to cue it up would be, okay, now I'm going to take questions for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to leave you guys with a powerful story that transformed my life. And that way you give yourself a time limit and you are able to finish with a story and they know that it's coming. Now, there's 6 closing strategies mentioned in this chapter, and the first one is ending with a quote. If a quote reinforces the message of your speech, it can be a great way to close. It can also add weight and credibility to your speech. Now, if your speech is, let's say, for example, about one of my favorite topics, compounding interest, I could Google compounding interest and I could see who has spoken about that subject that has credibility and weight to their name. And I actually gave the speech at Toastmasters, and I talked about how compounding interest is exponential. The more that you make, the more that that money will compound on itself. I basically compared compounding interest on how, given a long enough time horizon, you're going to see your money exponentially expand. The same thing happens with your mind when you learn. The more that you learn, the more that your mind is going to compound expand. And I tied those two together, and then I ended up closing it with two quotes. And I talked about Warren Buffett, who everybody knows Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett said, read books every day. That's how knowledge works. It builds up like compounding interest. So I was able to use a quote by Warren Buffett that tied in the two things that I was comparing: your knowledge in your mind and compounding interest. That was powerful. And then also, Albert Einstein, he says, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. And that will add credibility to my speech because Albert Einstein is such a credible and monumental figure, and people are going to understand and resonate with what he has to say. And that's an example of ending with a quote. Another example is ending with a poem. Now, I personally wouldn't do a poem because I think it could be boring, but that's an example given in the book. The third is ending with a call to action. At the very end of your speech, give a practical, one step, easy to follow thing that the audience should do after you give their speech. And maybe that call to action is write down the most important takeaway that you had from the speech. And then once you get home, share it with one person. And that's something that could have a powerful impact as a result of that call to action. Then number 4, which is a closing strategy, is letting your audience speak. Now remember, this one's risky, but your last words linger. So if it's your audience that speaks last, your audience's last words are going to linger. Now this can allow the audience to leave inspired and create memorable moments because they participated and they'll remember their own words. That one's a little riskier because they could say something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and doesn't support your overall message, but it's something to consider. And a lot of this is based on who you're speaking to, your audience, and what their credibility is. Then number 5 is you can ask a question. You can ask a question that causes the audience to reflect. One important thing to note here is that it must support the message of your speech. There's an example of the book where Craig Valentine, who is the overall author of the book, each individual chapter is written by a certified world-class speaking coach who is trained and certified through Craig Valentine. And Craig Valentine oversees every chapter in the book, and he's the overall author, along with Mitch Meyerson. But Craig Valentine gives a speech, and he talks about how people get complacent, and people that are doing good in life are sometimes the people that struggle the most because they're just walking through days and weeks without giving their full potential because they're not having anything that's bad in their life. They're just good. So just moving slowly but surely. And in some cases, that's fine. But he's somebody that's super ambitious and wants to be great. And good is not good enough. And he says, are you too good to be great? And if you think about that, that's a powerful quote to end with. And then in another example is number 6, which is circling back. So an example could be a speech that begins with a story can end with the conclusion of that story. So you set it up at the beginning, you circle back to it at the end, you wrap it all together, tie a bow on it, and call it done. And those are the 6 closing strategies. And then lastly, you want to make sure with your closing that you spend enough time summarizing what you talked about. Whether your talk is structured using numbers, like a list, 1, 2, and 3, or an acronym. For example, Craig Valentine uses TALL, T-A-L-L, think, act, laugh, and learn. Or it could be letters. Example, the 3 E's of speaking: educate, encourage, and entertain. Whatever the case is, it could be some kind of structural tool, but just build in the time that you need at the end and then in the closing to review each of the main points. And to summarize, overall, don't do two things. Do not end your speech or presentation with a question and answer session, and do not introduce anything new. Two things that you should do is let your audience know that you're about to close your speech, and they'll pay close attention to your final words, and think about designating about 10% of your speech for the closing. And then there's 6 closing strategies. You can end with a quote. It'll help build your credibility. You can end with a poem. It's clever and unique. You can end with a call to action, that one specific action. You can close by letting your audience speak because their last words will linger. And then you could close by asking a question, by causing reflection. And then finally, you can close by circling back or maybe finishing a previous point. Use whichever of these tactics you want as long as it fits in and supports your main message. And now that you know the importance of closing your speech or presentation with impact, I encourage you to write down your top 5 favorite quotes. And these quotes can be used as a close for your next speech or presentation. Think of your top 5 favorite quotes. Then you just have to make sure that it aligns with your overall message. And if you can't think of 5, I encourage you to just do some research. Research famous quotes by somebody that you respect, and then try to get 5 quotes yourself from that person. This episode concludes part 2 of the book, World Class Speaking in Action. And now that we've finished the World Class Speaking structure section, we're going to move on to part 3, starting in the next episode, and it's creating world-class content. So we're going to actually get into the fine details of what you should be speaking to and what you should be doing in terms of content. And this is going to start next episode. So we'll kick off this new section where you'll learn how to leave a positive impression on your audience. That's all we've got for this episode on the World Class Speaking podcast series. Until next time, remember that becoming a great communicator is so important because it leads to greater impact, influence, and income. Thank you for listening and have a great day.